Hi, friends. Well, we're looking today at the book of Joshua, and this is part number 2. The year is 2024. I'm your old pal Papa Dale, and this is the Jan Hus Institute of Biblical Studies Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Literature degree program. Because there are always new viewers, I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm a retired pastor, teacher, theologian, and professor with over 50 years of service to the Lord Jesus Christ. My name is Dale Warren, but professionally I'm known in my writings, lectures, and teachings as D.A. Warren. But my friends, they just all call me Papa Dale, so you can too. Now you can see the details of my personal testimony, family life, education, and ministry experience on other videos on this playlist. So for now, let's get right into today's topic, which is the book of Joshua, part 2. Since this is part 2, we've already gone through part 1, and I believe the place at which we concluded part 1 was at the end of the storyline. And so we continue in the lecture series with the topic of transitions. The book of Joshua, let me put on my glasses so I can see these notes a little better. That's better. The book of Joshua is considered a transitional book in the life of the Hebrews for several reasons. It marks the transition from the nomadic wilderness wanderings under Moses' leadership to the settlement and establishment in the Promised Land under Joshua. Here are key aspects to this transition. 1. The leadership transition from Moses to Joshua. 2. The geographical transition from the Promised Land and crossing the Jordan River. From the wilderness to the Promised Land and crossing the Jordan River. 3. The covenantal transition, the renewal of the covenant, the implementation of the Mosaic Law. 4. The military and political transition, conquest and division of the Canaan land and establishment of tribal territories. 5. Spiritual and religious transition, the centralization of worship and the destruction of idolatry. 6. Societal transition, from wanderers to settlers, and the establishment of cities. 7. Continuity and the fulfillment of the promise. So, the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and the preparation for monarchy that is coming up in Israel's history. Well, Joshua marks the shift from wilderness wanderings to settlement in the Promised Land, from leadership under Moses to Joshua, from nomadic to settled life, and from the Promised Land to its actual possession. It sets the stage for the subsequent history of Israel as a nation in their own land. So let's have a look at the historical and cultural setting. This historical and cultural setting of the book of Joshua can be understood through several key aspects. The historical background in the events of the book of Joshua occur in the late Bronze Age, approximately 1400 to 1200 BC. This period represents the time when the Israelites moved from the wilderness into the promised land of Canaan after their exodus from Egypt and 40 years of wandering. And the second point in historical and cultural setting is Canaanite culture. The Canaanite city-states were characterized by their own cultures, languages, and religious practices, which introduced polytheism and rituals, often in conflict with the monotheism of the Israelites. The Canaanites worshipped gods like Baal, Asherah, and their practices included orgiastic sex in worship, prostitute priests, child sacrifices, and polygamous worship, which posed a significant challenge to the Israelites' faithfulness to Yahweh. Historical cultural context, point number 3, the tribal confederation. The Israelites were organized as a confederation of tribes during this period, each with its own territory. The tribal system was essential for governance and social organization, which influenced how land was divided and shared among the tribes. Point number 4, military campaigns and warfare. The conquests described in Joshua reflect the common military practices of the time, including siege warfare, ambush strategies, and alliances. The Israelites' victories were interpreted as acts of divine intervention, highlighting their covenantal relationship with God. Now, there's one campaign that I don't think reflected common military practices at the time, and that was when they stormed the city of Jericho, marching around the city 6 times, blowing trumpets and so forth. So anyway, moving on, the 5th point under cultural historical aspects is covenantal theology. The book of Joshua presents a strong theme of covenant, emphasizing the Israelites' obligation to remain faithful to God's laws and instructions. They are reminded that their success in conquering the land is directly tied to their obedience to God's commands. Think their attempt to conquer the city of Ai. Point number 6, archaeological evidence. Archaeological findings provide insight into the cities and regions mentioned in the book. Evidence shows a transition from urban destruction to a more settled way of life, supporting the narrative of conquest and settlement. Point 7, social practices. The cultural context includes practices related to land ownership, communal responsibilities, and family lineage. The division of land among the tribes reflects the importance of heritage and family ties in ancient Israelite society. Point number 8, religious practices. The Israelites were instructed to establish places of worship and conduct religious ceremonies, which included observing the Passover and fulfilling their obligations of offering and sacrifice, key components of their religious life. Overall, the book of Joshua is deeply embedded in the historical, cultural, and religious contexts of the ancient Near East, illustrating the struggles, triumphs, and beliefs of the Israelite people as they navigated their identity and mission in the Promised Land. Well, what are the theological origins of doctrines that arise out of the book of Joshua? The book presents several significant theological ideas that have shaped the understanding of Israel's relationship with God and their identity as His chosen people. Here are some of those themes. 1. Covenant faithfulness. A major theme of the book of Joshua is the concept of the covenant. The narrative emphasizes God's faithfulness to His promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob regarding land and descendants. The Israelites' success in conquering Canaan is seen as a fulfillment of these divine promises, underscoring the importance of loyalty and obedience to the covenant. Point 2, divine sovereignty. Joshua portrays Yahweh as sovereign over the events of history and the affairs of nations. The victories of Israel are attributed not to military might, but to God's intervention and guidance. This reflects a theological understanding that God controls the outcomes of human actions and historical events. Point number 3, the Holy War. The concept of holy war is significant in Joshua, where the Israelite conquests are framed as battles commanded by God. Israel is the instrument used by God to judge the sin of the Canaanite nations. This theology suggests that certain wars were ordained by God for the purpose of purging evil and establishing His order. This theme raises complex questions about ethics and divine justice in the context of violence. These questions are satisfied by understanding Yahweh is the Creator, He owns all the earth and all the people, and He sometimes enacts judgment on a rebellious people using another nation to execute that judgment. Point number 4, land as a theological element. The Promised Land is more than just a geographical area. It represents a place of divine presence and blessing. The land is seen as a gift from God to His people, and entering it is fulfillment of God's promise. This focus on land has significant theological implications for identity, belonging, and community. Point number 5, faith and obedience. The importance of faith and obedience to God's commands is a recurring theme. Joshua encourages the Israelites to be strong and courageous, trusting in God's promises. The narrative illustrates that obedience brings blessing, while disobedience leads to failure, exemplifying a foundational aspect of Yahwistic theology. Point number 7, leadership and continuity. The transition from Moses to Joshua highlights the continuity of God's leadership in Israel. Joshua is portrayed as a faithful leader who upholds God's commandments and continues the mission of leading Israel into the Promised Land. This emphasizes the role of divinely appointed leadership in guiding the community. And then we have the theological origin of inclusivity of the Gentiles. From the beginning of the Exodus, the nation consisted of a mixed multitude, including Egyptians. Not everyone was a direct descendant of Abraham. In addition, the inclusion of figures like Rahab, a Canaanite, as part of God's people speaks to a broader theological vision that recognizes faith over ethnicity. Rahab's faith in God leads to her protection and inclusion in Israel, reflecting themes of grace and redemption. And then another theological concept having its origin in Joshua is number 8, the last one we're going to deal with, remembrance and heritage. The establishment of memorials, like the stones taken from the Jordan River, for example, serves as a means of remembering God's faithfulness and acts of salvation. This practice highlights the importance of historical memory in shaping faith and identity within the community. These theological ideas from the book of Joshua continue to influence Jewish and Christian thought, especially in discussions around faith, community, divine justice, and the significance of history in the life of believers. So let's look at the next point, which is intertextuality. Intertextuality refers to the relationship between the texts of the Bible and the way they influence, reference, or echo one another. In the context of the book of Joshua, this concept has several impacts. The first intertextual impact is historical contextualization. The book of Joshua is often linked to earlier texts, such as the Torah, and particularly Exodus and Numbers. This intertextuality provides a historical framework for understanding Israel's journey into the Promised Land, and it reinforces themes of covenant and divine promise. Intertextuality, point number 2, thematic continuity. Intertextual references to earlier biblical narratives, like the faithfulness of God, the importance of leadership, and the consequences of disobedience, create a sense of continuity. For example, Joshua's leadership reflects Moses' model, tying the two narratives together and emphasizing the importance of faith. Point number 3, literary devices. The use of intertextuality, such as allusion, metaphor, enriches the narrative. For instance, echoes of earlier battles and conquests can highlight the ongoing struggle between Israel and its enemies, reinforcing the concept of divine assistance. Point number 4, religious and cultural identity. The intertextual connection to prophetic texts and the Psalms can help define the identity of the Israelite community. It validates their experiences of conquest and conflict as part of a larger divine plan and narrative, contributing to their collective memory. And point number 5, the last one that we'll deal with concerning intertextuality is the moral and ethical lessons. By referencing previous stories, for example, the fall of Jericho mirroring the themes of trust and obedience found in Exodus, the book of Joshua conveys moral lessons about faithfulness to God and the consequences of human actions. Overall, intertextuality in the book of Joshua serves to deepen the reader's understanding of the text while situating it within a broader narrative and theological framework. The next point is progressive revelation. The doctrine of progressive revelation suggests that God's truth is revealed gradually over time through the Scripture, becoming clearer as biblical history unfolds. In the book of Joshua, several key examples illustrate this concept. Progressive revelation point number 1, promise fulfillment. The foundation for Israel's conquest of Canaan begins with God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis, where he promises land to Abraham's descendants. In Joshua, we see the fulfillment of this promise as Israel enters the promised land under Joshua's leadership. This progressive revelation highlights the unfolding nature of God's promises. Point 2, leadership transition. Previous texts, particularly in Exodus and Deuteronomy, establish Moses as the primary leader of Israel. And when Moses dies, God appoints Joshua to lead the people. This transition shows how God's plan is revealed progressively, first through Moses, then through Joshua, and it indicates that leadership and divine guidance change and develop as the narrative progresses. Point number 3, God's presence and guidance. Early in the Bible, God's presence is often associated with specific places, like the tabernacle. In Joshua, the concept of God's presence is further developed. For instance, the crossing of the Jordan River symbolizes God's miraculous presence, reflecting his continued presence with his people. This deepens the understanding of God not just as a distant deity, but as a personal God actively involved in their journey. And progressive revelation point number 4, covenantal instructions. The instructions given to Joshua regarding the conquest of Canaan build upon the laws and covenants established in previous books. For example, the call to be strong and courageous, Joshua 1, 6-9, emphasizes the necessity of obedience to God's law and the importance of faith, revealing more about God's requirements and expectations of his people. And progressive revelation point number 5, the last one we'll deal with, is inclusivity of salvation. The story of Rahab, a Canaanite woman who helps the Israelite spies, illustrates progressive revelation regarding God's mercy and inclusivity. Her faith leads to her and her family's salvation, pointing towards a broader understanding of God's plan that includes not just the Israelites, but also those from other nations who believe. In summary, the book of Joshua exemplifies the doctrine of progressive revelation through its portrayal of covenant fulfillment, leadership development, evolving understandings of God's presence and salvation. Each of these elements builds upon earlier revelations, providing a deeper insight into God's character and his relationship with humanity. Now let's have a look at some of the literature elements found within the book of Joshua. For example, Hebrew idioms. The book of Joshua contains several significant Hebrew idioms and phrases that convey deeper meaning within the text. Here are a few noteworthy examples. Pardon me. Okay, Hebrew idioms. The first one that we deal with is, quote, be strong and courageous. This phrase appears multiple times in Joshua. For example, Joshua 1:6, 1:7, and 1:9. And the phrase serves as a command from God to Joshua as Joshua prepares to lead the Israelites into the promised land. This idiom captures the essence of faith and determination, emphasizing the need for strength and resolute courage in the face of challenges. Point number 2, the land flowing with milk and honey. Now, this idiom describes Canaan as a fertile and prosperous land, filled with abundance. It conveys the richness and blessings that await the Israelites, reinforcing the idea of God fulfilling his promises to his people. Point number 3, to take possession. This illustration frequently appears in Joshua when discussing the Israelites entering and claiming the land. See Joshua 1:11. It reflects the legal and spiritual responsibility of the Israelites to inherit the land that God promised their ancestors, signifying both entitlement and active appropriation of God's blessings. They couldn't just move in and wait for God to give it to them. They had to go and take it. And so let's look at Hebrew idiom number 4 after I rub my eyes. Hebrew idiom number 4, cutting a covenant. This phrase, while more commonly seen across the Hebrew Bible, is significant in Joshua during the renewal of the covenant at Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. See Joshua 8:30 through 35. It expresses the formal establishment of God's relationship with his people and the mutual obligations that arise from this sacred agreement. Then we see the Hebrew idiom, the name Joshua itself, which in Hebrew is Yeshua. The name Joshua itself, which means Yahweh is salvation, presents significant theological implications in the context of the narrative. The name Joshua indicates God's role as a deliverer and foreshadows the ultimate salvation that comes through the later figure of Jesus in Christian theology. And Hebrew idiom number 6, quote, as for me and my house. In Joshua 24:15, Joshua declares his commitment to serve the Lord along with his entire household. And that would be children, wife, and servants. This idiom emphasizes the importance of familial allegiance to God and the collective responsibility that a household of faith practices to Yahweh. Now, these idioms enrich the text of Joshua, providing layers of meaning that reflect the historical, cultural, and theological context of the Israelite experience. They also serve to convey key themes of faith, identity, and divine promise that resonate throughout the biblical narrative. And keep in mind, there are literally dozens and dozens and dozens of these in the book of Joshua and in every one of the books of the Bible. So now let's look at the certain literature types. The book of Joshua contains various types of literature that contribute to its overall meaning and impact. Here are some of the primary literary genres found in the text and their implications. The first one we look at is narrative or prose. Much of the book of Joshua is written in narrative prose, which recounts the history of the Israelites' conquest of Canaan land. This storytelling approach allows readers to witness the unfolding of events, character development, and God's intervention in history. The use of narrative contributes to the themes of leadership, obedience, and the fulfillment of divine promises. Point number 2, literature types, poetry and hymns. Certain sections of the texts, such as the Song of Deborah, mentioned in the context of Israelite victories, contain poetic elements. These passages often employ parallelism, imagery, and rhythm, enhancing the emotional resonance and memorability of key themes like victory and divine support. Poetry elevates the emotional experience of the narrative, invoking awe and reverence for God's actions. Literature type number 3, legal literature. The book of Joshua includes legal elements particularly related to the allocation of land, Joshua chapters 13 through 21. This genre reflects ancient Israelite laws and customs, focusing on justice, community, and the importance of divine inheritance. The legal texts affirm God's sovereignty and the necessity of following His commandments in maintaining order and righteousness within the community. Literature type number 4, covenantal literature. The themes surrounding the covenant between God and Israel are central to Joshua. The text frequently reminds readers of the covenantal promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This literature underscores Israel's identity as God's chosen people and emphasizes the significance of their loyalty and obedience to God to secure His blessings. Literature type number 5, chronicles and records. This text contains elements of historical records, particularly in its detailed listings of battles and territories. This literary approach provides a sense of legitimacy and authenticity to the Israelite claim over Canaan, demonstrating their successes as evidence of divine favor. It also serves to preserve collective memory and identity. And literature type number 6, rhetorical speeches. The book of Joshua includes speeches, particularly by Joshua, as he addresses the Israelites, for example, Joshua chapter 24. These rhetorical moments serve to inspire, challenge, and encourage the people. The speeches often highlight the need for faithfulness to Yahweh and invoke communal responsibility, enhancing the motivational aspect of the text. So what is the impact of literature types? The combination of these literature types in the book of Joshua allows for a multifaceted interpretation of the text. They work together to emphasize God's faithfulness by recounting Israel's history and victories. The text illustrates God's commitment to His covenant. They also reinforce community identity. The legal and covenantal literature highlights the collective responsibility of the Israelites in maintaining their identity as Yahweh's chosen people. And it also inspires faithfulness. Rhetorical speeches and narratives call the community to remain loyal to Yahweh amid all the challenges. Overall, the diverse literature types such as the diverse literature types enhance the narrative and enhance the theological themes, making the book of Joshua a profound reflection on faith, community, and the active presence of God in the lives of the people. So, I'm your old pal, Papa Dale. I've been your host. This is the year 2024, and the lecture you just watched is the Book of Joshua, Part 2 of 3. Now, greater insights leading to deeper relationship with Jesus await you if you'll only just keep watching the next video and keep reading the notes. Please remember that you must read the printed notes and look up the scriptures too if you are studying for the Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Literature degree. You can find these notes in the video transcript or at the link below. And until I see you the next time, this is your old pal Papa Dale saying I'm going to be praying for you that you will be well and that you will be blessed.